First day. We don't have a.
All right. Welcome back to Senate, or welcome to Senate Education 132 on Friday, April 7th. We are jumping into our discussions. We've done a little bit on independent schools, but really not much. But now we have the House Bill, H483. And so we're going to have Ms. St. James walk us through it. It's in your packet. And then we're going to take a break. We're going to have Secretary French in here for a few minutes. Then we're going to return to 483 with Rep. Conlon. We've got our fiscal note on school meals, and may have Don Tinney if we're still in the booth. So, St. James, do you mind walking us through 483? Not line by line. We'll just overall each section, and then Representative Conlon can take us through some of it as well.
Sure. Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel. You all have budgeted until 2 for this, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
Does that work for you?
Oh, I'm whatever you need
okay,
for me.
great.
This is it for me this afternoon.
Oh, great.
So,
Just so people know, if you have additional questions and we don't finish by the time Secretary French arrives, we'll take a break, and we can always come back to you.
I'm
And then we
available.
can always put Conlon until Ms. St. James is finished.
So you all should have H483 as passed by the House. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it starts with the findings section.
Great.
The first 1, 2, 3 findings are actually lifted right from S219 from last year.
Which these guys weren't here.
Right. So do you want me to go through the first finding is a reference to the Vermont Constitution and the
I think that'd
Education
be great,
Clause.
please.
And the Brigham decision that we've talked about many times now from 1997, talking about the fact that education is the state's responsibility, but the state may delegate to local towns and cities the authority to finance and administer the schools within their borders. But it's the state's responsibility for education. And then subsection B is a kind of a jump from that Brigham decision. So from this, it is evident that the state has a constitutional obligation to provide education to its youth. Many Vermont school districts operate schools, but others do not. Vermont is a relatively sparsely populated and mountainous state that has made the operation of public schools unviable in certain regions of the state. Students who live in these regions do not have the choice of enrolling in a public school in their districts. Their only choice is to enroll in a public school operated by another school district or an independent school, or to be homeschooled. We're on page 2.
We had that in 219?
You did. Subsection 3, C, on line 3. Therefore, in order to fulfill its constitutional requirement to provide public education to its youth, the state permits school districts that do not operate schools, called non-operating school districts, to use public funds to send their resident youth to public schools operated by other school districts or to certain independent schools. That is really just a summary of current law. And then subsection D on line 8 on page 2 is new. It's not in 219, S219 from last year. And it is a quotation taken from the auditor's report from 2020 that was looking at the difference between the laws that are applicable to public schools and independent schools. And it is a quotation from the Secretary of Education. And it starts on line 12 there. This evolution in education policy has taken place in the absence of a single coherent design for the system as a whole. The resulting differences highlighted in this report should not come as a surprise. They should, along with all education statutes and regulations, be examined to determine whether the current framework makes sense and whether it enables the state to provide all students equal access to high quality education.
So who is the Secretary of Education in 2020?
Dan French.
Okay, should we say that when he's leaving, or? And yeah, we can get back to that.
Pure policy.
Yeah, go ahead.
So the first, the big amendment comes right up front in section 2.
Okay.
So page 2, section 2 is an amendment to section 166, which you all, I think, know by now is the approved independent school statute. So it's all of the statutory requirements and process for a private school to become an approved independent school in Vermont. And the first thing on page 3 is it says here is on line 9, and this language is not in effect now, what you see here. The strike through is all language that was added by Act 173 that will take effect on July 1, 2023. And it's actually just being moved to a different section of the bill.
We'll talk a little bit about that.
So on page 4, subdivision 5 here, I just left this in. There's no reason for it to be included here other than to help the reader at this point refer back to the state board's powers regarding revoking, suspending, or imposing conditions on the approval of an approved independent school. So then the new language starts on page 5. And so subsection B of section 166 is the approved independent school section. And then there's a whole bunch of subdivisions under B that are different requirements for that approval process. What this bill proposes to do is add a new subdivision 9 that starts: an approved independent school that intends to accept public tuition shall be approved by the state board is eligible to receive public tuition only on the condition that the school complies with the following requirements, provided that this subdivision does not apply to therapeutic independent schools. So what this is saying is you got to do everything above 9 applies to all approved independent schools.
Yes, please.
Quick question about the therapeutic approved independent schools. I mean, I would want to see this bill, broadly apply to every school, and so I'm just wondering why there's a carve out for therapeutic schools.
So we will have, just so you know, Chair Conlon in, who might be able to answer that, but if you want to give it a shot as well.
So almost all of this is going to be policy decisions.
Okay.
In general, therapeutic schools exist solely for, and what this bill does is also add a definition of therapeutic school. The concept of a therapeutic school exists, and the definition actually exists in the 2200 series, but it does not exist in the state board or in the statutes. So therapeutic schools, page 17, they're only open to students who are on an IEP or a Section 504 plan. And so they are existing for a certain purpose that they might not be able to meet all of these criteria. So rather than putting them all out of business for accepting publicly tuitioned students, this is saying there's a separate process for the therapeutic schools.
Okay.
But it is a policy decision. I would really encourage you to hear from the special education experts on how specialized the therapeutic schools are and their approval process, and what that means, and how some of these requirements, if you were to require them of therapeutic independent schools, what that would do.
I know we heard, is the Compass School in your district?
Yes.
We did receive an email from them. Did you receive it? Can you forward it to Senator Sheen? I know that they have concerns with this section as well, because I think they would like an admissions process, and they're not therapeutic.
I don't believe they are a therapeutic
Right,
school.
they are
General education.
general, yes.
Did you hear anything from Lehigh School in Bolton?
I've not.
Because they are
Therapeutic, okay,
I've heard.
okay, great.
So I will note that the language of Act 173 that requires an approved independent school to enroll students on an IEP if they are placed there by their education agency or their IEP team, if the school wants to accept public tuition.
Yeah.
That also excludes therapeutic schools from that.
Okay.
So that would go into effect. That one requirement on the eligibility to receive public tuition that goes into effect on July 1 now.
Yeah.
Also excludes therapeutic schools.
Okay.
So subdivision 9 is saying, if you want to accept public funds and you're not a therapeutic school, if you're an approved independent school, you have to meet these requirements. So the first requirement is that language from Act 173 that's struck on page, I think it's 3. Yep. So little I there, the school agrees notwithstanding any provision of law to the contrary to enroll any student who requires special education services and who is placed in or referred to the approved independent school as an appropriate placement in least restrictive environment for the student by the students, by EP team, or the local education agency. That's right from the language that was struck on page 3. That requirement is going to take effect with July 1, 2023, without any further action by the General Assembly.
Is that what we put in Act 173?
Yes. Yep.
Which passed 3 years ago.
2018.
So this is essentially, I'm sorry, this is essentially about to become law anyways, this one section.
Yes, it's what was struck on page 3,
You said it was 173.
Act 173. So the second requirement under subdivision 9A is on page 5, line 12. So the approved independent school that wants to be eligible to receive public tuition shall provide local education agencies with an attendance report for students, their publicly tuitioned students, at an interval determined by and in a format approved by the agency. Line 15, the school shall provide LEAs with a report of the academic progress of publicly tuitioned students at an interval determined by and in a format approved by the agency.
Does everyone know what an LEA is? You want to mention what that is, and then I can add or something?
Sure, it stands for Local Education Agency. I'm paraphrasing, it's actually spelled out here. In Vermont, that's usually it's the supervisory union or the supervisory district, and they are the entity that's charged with certain responsibilities, particularly special education oversight and responsibilities.
And if you don't have, so if you're in a choice town, you still have a board, right? That's the
You are
LEA.
still a school district
Still a school
with a
district.
budget
Okay,
and a supervisory union,
Yeah.
et cetera.
Okay.
You just made the choice to provide for your education by tuitioning.
okay. So that
Yes.
report would go back to
So the
that. So
supervisory.
that's
union.
super great. Thank you.
The school shall provide local education agencies with a report of any enrollment change for students attending the school on public tuition. I'm on line 18 through 20, including withdrawals, suspensions, or expulsions, provided that the school shall notify on page 6 a local education agency the same school day if the school is considering expelling a publicly tuitioned student. On line 3. The school has adopted and implemented policies and procedures to comply with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act and the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. This language would be a new addition to Title 16, but it is currently in effect in the state board's 2200 series rules. The school shall not, I'm on line 7. The school shall not use an admissions process for publicly tuitioned students that includes mandatory interviews, academic entrance exams, academic history, mandatory campus visits, or consideration of ability to pay for any costs or fees, provided that the school may request proof of a student's most recently completed grade.
Just curious, are we still in the section that was transplanted or are we in new language?
This is only,
Nope, the only section that was transplanted is lines 7 through 11 on page 5. Everything else is new language.
Can we, I'm struggling with the provided that first, maybe because it's late in the day. Can we process this for a second?
Sure.
So,
what line?
10.
Yeah.
So they shall not use an admissions process that includes X, Y, and Z, provided that.
But they can do.
Okay, thank you.
So like they can't ask for those things.
Thanks.
It's a term that we use often, but it essentially stands for, but they can do this,
Okay.
or, but consider this. So they can't do everything before provided that, but everything after they may do. So they may request proof of a student's most recently completed grade. The school they can also set a capacity limit on the number of publicly tuitioned students they will accept. And they have to establish a non-discriminatory selection process for when the number of publicly tuition student applicants exceeds any capacity limits they've set.
And that's why, just on this, I'm interested in hearing from Compass next week and others, because how do you, if you are, I thought they were a special education school, but maybe I'm wrong.
Maybe I'm wrong.
No, I
don't
don't.
know.
How do you determine if the student's a right fit? If you're, if you can't interview them to see if they meet your,
That's
But yeah, we can-
policy.
yeah.
And I would encourage you to talk to
or landmark
the
or,
House
yeah,
on their thoughts behind that.
yeah, okay, thanks.
Line 18 on
Is
page
Greenwood School still around? Is that ring a bell?
Yes,
Yeah, okay.
Green Street School, I'm not sure. I'll check.
Please, Senator Dooley.
No, I was gonna say, but if you want to check that.
We're on line 18 on page 6. The school shall provide the results of all state mandated assessments of students on public tuition to AOE, which shall publish the results on its website in a manner consistent with the publication of the same results for public school students. Page 7, line 1. The school's tuition rate for publicly tuition students shall be the same as or lower than the tuition rate for private payer students. And both tuition rates shall be published on the school's website and reported to AOE annually. Line 5, publicly tuition students shall not be charged an application fee, an academic fee, or any other fees for academic materials. And 7, the school attests on or before August 1st of each year to compliance with the requirements of this subdivision 9, all other statutory requirements for approved independent schools, and the board's rules for approved independent schools on a form created by the agency, including documentation of the following: a statement of non-discrimination posted on the school's website and included in the school's application materials that is consistent with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act and the Vermont Fair Employment Practices Act. An assurance signed by the head of school that the school complies with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act in all aspects of the school's admissions and operations. And an assurance signed by the head of school that no public funds were used to subsidize the tuition of private payer students. So that, we just ran through, there's a subdivision B, and we'll walk through that quickly. But that, what we just walked through are all of the new requirements that would be placed on an approved independent school if it wanted to be eligible to receive public tuition.
Question, Senator Chin.
And these requirements, are they similar or identical to what public schools have to do?
It depends on the requirement.
Yeah, I imagine some are exclusive for an independent
Exactly.
school, but,
Do you have a specific
Is
one that
this-
you're wondering about?
well, basically, I just want to make sure that the same rules that public schools follow are as similar, if not identical, to the rules that we are trying to impose for private schools and independent schools, but yeah, so generally, public schools have to follow at least most of what's in here.
I wouldn't say that because this is really specific to a private school. So right now, I don't believe, so if we want to go back and look.
So I guess one example,
Yeah.
page 6, lines 7 through 10.
Mhm.
Public schools don't do mandatory, as far as I know, they don't do mandatory interviews. They don't do entrance exams, academic history, mandatory campus visits, or consideration to be able to pay.
So for public schools, there is a statute, it's 1093, I believe, that talks about what a public school can consider for non-resident, for admission of non-resident students. Am I
Just for
right?
non-residents.
1093, I got it right, okay. So in Title 16, 1093, for non-resident students, so if you are domiciled, so 1073 is the definition of legal people. We talked about this a little bit the last few days in relation to Senator Chittenden's bill. So if you are domiciled, if you're a legal resident of a school district, that's the public school that you are entitled to attend. There are some separate provisions throughout state law but that's basically how it works for everyone. Section 1093 talks about what a school board may consider for admission of non-resident students, and it's very short. The school board may receive into the schools under its charge non-resident students under such terms and restrictions as it deems best, and money received for the instruction of the students shall be paid into the school fund of the district. There was some testimony that House Education took on what public schools are actually doing in relation to non-resident students. I think there are the same capacity limits that you would see anywhere, right? If you are scaled for your residents and you have an influx of non-resident students, you might have capacity limits. You don't have to take those non-resident students, but they certainly can't be using discriminatory process to say yay or nay to a non-resident student. There was a School Boards Association suggested model policy on this issue for non-resident tuition students to public schools. And in the House Education testimony on this, there was some suggestion that perhaps that policy was not.
Susanna Davis put out a memo, correct, that it was discriminatory?
Yes, I have actually not seen that memo.
It was.
But I
it was in
believe
the
that was,
paper, yeah.
it was around the disproportionate number of students affected by expulsion policies or disciplinary matters in certain classes. And so if school boards were allowed to take that into account, that might have a disparate impact. So I don't believe the school board, I think the School Boards Association has pulled that policy from their model policy bank, but there's no requirement for any school district to have a policy on this. So what school districts are actually doing and what the criteria they are weighing for publicly tuitioned non-resident students into their school district is going to vary. But they certainly are all subject to the same anti-discrimination laws, both on the state and federal level.
One more question.
Yeah.
I want to go back to capacity. If this were to pass, and let's say a school, smaller independent school, let's say there's a student who's on an IEP, but that independent school doesn't have capacity, and they're at their max. Can they turn that person away? Can they turn that person away actually regardless of whether they have an IEP if they're at capacity?
If they want, take capacity off the table. If they want to be eligible to receive public tuition under Act 173, which goes into effect on July 1, 2023, should you take no further action, they would have to accept that student. If that student was placed there by their local education agency or their IEP team, usually they're working together, but not if a parent just knocked on the door and said, my child is on an IEP and I feel that this is the best place for them.
Okay.
They would not be required to accept the student.
They would not be required to accept the student.
If they wanted to receive public tuition. There is the Public Accommodations Act prohibits discrimination on the basis of disability. So the facts and scenarios under which that analysis would be made may trigger a public accommodations issue. But in order to be eligible to receive public tuition, the school has to agree to accept students on an IEP if they are placed there by their IEP team or the local education team.
Senator,
Thank you. Number subsection 10, Roman numeral 10, page 7, line 7. So there's going to be a form created by the agency and schools are going to have to attest to compliance. That does not seem like the same procedure that public schools have to go through. Just a,
you said 10, section 10.
yeah. I mean, it just seems.
So I can't speak to, my understanding is there's lots of things that lots of forms public schools have to fill out. I can't speak to what all of those are. But I agree, I don't think there's anything in Title 16 that's completely analogous to an attestation like this, but I don't,
Yeah, I can ask Representative Conlon too, if there's any other level of scrutiny than just this form that's being filled out. I can ask him that too.
do you mean level of scrutiny for independent schools or for public schools?
Independent.
I'm not sure I
Sure,
understand your
oh.
question.
Oh, okay, so they're attesting, so the school attests each year to compliance of the requirements
Mhm.
by filling out a form.
Mhm.
And that's it? Or are there, I'm sure there's probably more that I'm ignorant of, but that's what's I'm seeing in front of me.
Yes, so let's walk through subdivision B right now.
Yeah.
But yes, so subdivision B on page 8 states that there's no private right of action created by this subdivision 9, all those requirements you just walked through, against an approved independent school approved by the state board is eligible to receive public tuition for failure to comply with any of the requirements of subdivision 9. I want to pause there. So what this is saying is, if I, as a private citizen, have knowledge or belief that an approved independent school that's eligible to receive public tuition is not following one of the criteria we just walked through, I could make a complaint about that. But the fact that that school is not complying with number 6 doesn't give me any independent basis in the law to sue that school and say, you are not compliant. This section doesn't. There may be other bases in the law that would give someone a right of action to take action if they believe there is some law that is not being followed. But this language is intended to mean we're not opening the door for a whole bunch of private lawsuits just because X school is not following number 6. Now, if number 6, I don't know what number 6 is off the top of my head. That's the admissions. So I think a better example would be number 5. Failure to comply with the Vermont Public Accommodations Act. If you have standing there, there's avenues for addressing a school not complying with the Public Accommodations Act. This is
Any
saying
school, company,
that the Public Accommodations Act applies to. The
Yeah,
Human
okay.
Rights Commission has jurisdiction over that.
okay.
This language is saying this is not creating an independent basis for you to say you're not following the Public Accommodations Act. But if we read on, line 4, the state board is authorized to use its powers under subdivision 5, which is that language I referenced that was kept in as kind of a point of reference, to revoke, suspend, or impose conditions on the eligibility of an approved independent school to receive public tuition for failure to comply with these requirements. Complaints of noncompliance shall be received, investigated, and resolved in accordance with subdivision 5 and the State Board of Education rules. And the person shall not coerce, threaten, interfere, or otherwise discriminate against any individual who alleges noncompliance with the requirements under the subdivision. So the state board has the power in statute to revoke, suspend, or impose conditions on an approved independent school. And the board's rules have kind of bifurcated responsibilities here. The agency is the repository for complaints. So the agency receives complaints and does investigations. And then the state board would act in a quasi-judicial manner to resolve those complaints. So that's already established in the state board rules. And that's a very basic summary of what that is. So this is saying, you know, if an approved independent school that wants to be eligible to receive public tuition is not following one of those 10 items we just walked through, they got to follow the process for accountability would be what's already in current law. There's nothing new added there other than the requirements themselves. The accountability piece or the state board's recourse is just what's already in current law.
Does that help? Just still a little bit, there's a lot there.
It does, I guess I just, I wish I could interface it with what the public school's doing, because it seems like they each have a different set of.
So, a lot of this is philosophical and policy, so it's really hard. There is not an, to go back to the quotation from the Secretary of Education on page 2. There hasn't really been, these systems are not parallel to each other. And H483 does not make them parallel. What I will say is, one fundamental difference in accountability is the public school system is governed by publicly elected officials who are accountable to the voters, and independent schools are not, right? Those are private institutions. So the public has recourse in the public setting in a way that the public does not have recourse in a private setting. So they're just two fundamentally different systems. But 483 does not make them equal.
Right, and just my observation is, and I could be wrong, is that it just seems as though the level of oversight is very different. And again, that's what we're saying, they are different in one system versus the other. And here, it just seems like the onus is really on someone seeing a trespass, seeing an issue, and then complaining about it, as opposed to there being a level of scrutiny embedded in the system that brings these things to light. That's all I'm saying.
I think that's a fair interpretation. There's no, this 483 doesn't propose any sort of annual review by an independent. It's self-attestation.
Whereas with the public, it's, help me out, so just so I understand.
So it's really hard to just talk public-private.
Right, but you said a few sentences ago that it's accurate that this is sort of complaint driven.
Yep.
But in the public, there's a culture or there's something else pulls it apart. So just help me out, just so we can understand this.
Yep, I'm not sure that's what I meant. But what I was trying to say is, it depends on the specific point you're talking about accountability on.
Okay,
There might be a process
okay.
for a specific piece.
Let's say discrimination, anti-discrimination.
So the Public Accommodations Act,
Applies to both equally.
if they are open to the general public.
Okay,
So if we are making an assumption for the sake of this conversation.
Yeah.
That approved independent schools are open to the general public. And the Public Accommodations Act applies to them. Then it's the same. The Human Rights Commission has jurisdiction over the Public Accommodations Act, regardless of what the public accommodation is.
Isn't Act 173 require the 2200? Isn't somebody saying, making a statement at some point that the independent schools, whether they like it or not, they are going to apply to the Public Accommodations Act?
So with the 2200 series and the language in 483, and tell me to stop talking.
No, you're good. Secretary French, when he comes in, we'll take a 5-minute break and then you can come
Well, I
right
just
back.
worry that people might be waiting on the other side of the door. Okay, they've heard me now. And the language regarding the Public Accommodations Act is very similar to what's in the 2200 series rules. So the 2200 series and H483 requires a school to comply with. There's also a section in here, section 14A. On page 20 is an amendment to the Public Accommodations Act itself and the definition of place of public accommodation, where the term school is further fleshed out. But if the Public Accommodations Act says, if you're just talking about, does the Public Accommodations Act apply to someone? That's one analysis. 483 and the 2200 series, it's flipped. You are requiring compliance with. So there is absolutely the possibility that an approved independent school can make the argument that the Public Accommodations Act does not apply to them, or does not apply to them. And or that requiring compliance with the Public Accommodations Act violates some fundamental rights that they hold. So 483.
Even if they take public funds.
Correct. So 483 requires compliance with the Public Accommodations Act. The 2200 series already requires compliance with the Public Accommodations Act. And that's great if everyone complies or say they are complying. But it is very possible that someone could say that's not fair because of certain fundamental rights, specifically religious liberty.
Sure, okay.
So this is a simple.
Oh boy, I hope
I didn't-
so. Those are
I-
never simple questions.
I didn't read the part that this section replaces, but this applies for all independent schools, regardless whether they're already registered or not.
So this is new. It doesn't replace anything. It's new.
Okay.
And it would not apply to every approved independent school. It would only apply to approved independent schools that want to be eligible to receive public tuition. And I think that's confusing.
No, I understand it.
Okay.
You have another question, sir?
They all want to receive $100?
I don't know.
Okay.
I'm sorry, Public Accommodations Act, how is it that anyone or any entity can say we don't want to comply with the Public Accommodations Act because it violates a fundamental right? What rule governs that?
What do you mean, what rule?
What-
What legal
what-
concept?
Yes.
So the First Amendment,
Okay.
freedom of religion, for example, may involve a closely held religious belief that marriage is between a man and a woman.
So,
Go ahead, no, go ahead.
well, I was going to say, following up that if it's not belief that's being regulated, rather it's conduct, and it's not particular or it's not intentional related, or it's not intentionally related to religion, but it is conduct that could be incidentally affected by that. It's still a way to avoid the Public Accommodations Act.
This is the next frontier,
Okay.
what we're getting into. So, there is a case, I believe, from the 1990s called Smith v. Department of, I forget, I know it's an Oregon
Oh,
case.
was it Employment Division?
Yes,
versus-
Employment Division,
Yes.
thank you. It's a US Supreme Court case. It is still good law today at 2:12. It stands, and I'm simplifying this very much. If you are really interested into digging into this, I would highly recommend inviting myself and Damian Leonard back. Damian Leonard is Ledge Counsel who is the public accommodations employment. You'll see him for collective bargaining things, et cetera. But speaking very generally, Smith stands for the principle that we got to be able to function as a society, right? There are fundamental rights that we need to acknowledge and not burden, but we also need to be able to function as a society. And so it's going to be hard to function as a society if there is always little carve-outs for every special belief or thought that might fall under one of these fundamental rights, like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, etc. So how do we function as a society? How do we use those police powers fairly and equally? So what Smith says is, if a law is generally applicable and neutral, it may incidentally burden some of those fundamental rights, including religious liberty. In that particular case, I believe it was a public employee who was using peyote for religious purposes, and it had something to do with and I believe he was fired, and based on laws for drugs in the workplace, and the Supreme Court eventually said, this law was generally applicable. It didn't single out the religion. It didn't single out the specific situation. And so we got to be able to function as a society, so it's okay. There's more to it than that. That's a very simplified way to put it. That was in the 90s, and it's still good law. In 2021, the Supreme Court looked at a case called Fulton v. City of Philadelphia. And that involved the City of Philadelphia and an adoption agency. So in Philadelphia, the City of Philadelphia contracts with private adoption agencies.
I'm just gonna ask, before we jump into Fulton, since Secretary French is here,
Oh, okay.
let's just do that, and then we can jump into Fulton. Is that okay?
Yeah.
That, Secretary French, sorry.
Yep.
Good
afternoon.
Good afternoon. We wish we could have you here in person as we have a little going away gift for you. But we did want to just gather and say thank you for everything that you have done for Vermont and its students. You've just personally helped this committee out an awful lot, and me over the past few years that we've worked together, which I appreciate. You certainly, when you look at your career, I'm sure there were many highlights, but certainly one that stands out for me is your time leading us through COVID. So I wanted to say thanks, and so did my colleagues.
Yeah, I appreciate that. Sorry to interrupt the discussion on Fulton. That was very exciting. I was enjoying that. So that's a wonderful present. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Well,
no, it's been.
This is what we really got you.
Oh, okay.
Hopefully you don't have one, but we are limited by where and what we can purchase.
Gotcha.
This happened to be upstairs in the case, cafeteria, and it's a nice image of the State House. And we will send it over with Lindsay, or I'll drop it off sometime. But we hope you'll put your mug or your milk or whatever you want to put in this and think of it.
Oh, it's very thoughtful of you. Thank you very much. And I've enjoyed working with you. It's COVID aside, it's we've done some really good structural work in policy and education in the last couple of years, and the Senate's leadership on that has been very critical to that. So thank you for your commitment and to education, and it's been really rewarding as me as secretary to work with such a collaborative team. So thank you.
Thank you. And when do you start? Can you tell us when you start and where you're?
Monday.
Monday. And are you in DC? Is that where you're going to be based?
Yeah, the organization's in DC. I'll largely be remote, but I'll be down in DC a little bit more this spring than I otherwise will be. But we, like a lot of organizations, went remote as a result of the pandemic and haven't really contemplated returning. But we still lease some office space in DC. So.
Well, thank you. Anybody else? Just
Right.
thank you. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Have a good afternoon.
Oh, good. So we can send that back with Lindsay or something. Yeah, be careful with
That's
it.
a nice picture.
Well, like we've said, it's 18th century, so be very careful with it. Ming Dynasty.
antique.
Yeah. So,
Lindsay on Tuesday.
what's that?
Lindsay on Tuesday.
Lindsay on Tuesday? Okay, so we'll put it back. That's fine. Yeah, let me see. Okay. Well,
Can I keep going? Okay.
thanks everybody for taking the time to.
Oh, goodness, yes.
Again, Beth St. James, Office of Legislative Counsel, Fulton, involved in adoption agency in the city that the city had contracted with for adoption of state youth in state custody for adoption purposes. And they had a contract that all of the agencies that they contracted with had to follow. The contract had a non-discrimination clause in there. And there was a Catholic adoption agency that had been working with the city for decades, who would not certify same-sex couples or unmarried couples based on their closely held religious beliefs. City of Philadelphia said, you are violating the anti-discrimination clause in our contract. We are not going to renew our contract. Case went all the way, and the adoption agency said, I have a problem with that. Case went all the way up to the Supreme Court. This is a 2021 Supreme Court case. So the controversy, remember, it takes years to make its way up there, was bubbling around for a little bit before that. And what the Supreme Court kicked the can down the road a little bit. And what the Supreme Court said was, you know what? We don't have to touch Smith, the holding in Smith here. We don't have to make a decision on whether or not we think this should still be good law, because we are finding that this law is not generally applicable, because there was an exemption in there. There was an exemption that said you got to follow the terms of this contract, especially the anti-discrimination piece, but exemptions can be made at the discretion of the city commissioner or whatever that person, the department level head was. And so what the Supreme Court said was, sincerely held religious beliefs trigger First Amendment rights, and if you are going to have an exemption in there, there is no way that you can provide an exemption for one person and not for a sincerely held religious belief, a fundamental right under the First Amendment. So the law is not applied generally, not generally applicable, okay? However, there were 3 Supreme Court justices who openly called out, I believe in a concurring opinion, whether or not Smith should be good law anymore. So usually when we're looking at government action, we're looking at different levels of scrutiny, right? We're looking at these rational basis tests, whether there's any reasonable governmental purpose behind the law, all the way up to strict scrutiny, which is what we're looking at for a fundamental right. And that's the government interest has to be compelling, and it has to be narrowly tailored to achieve the government's purpose. Very, very few things, very few government actions survive strict scrutiny when it's up against a fundamental right, especially the First Amendment.
Senator Sheen.
And it would be the Public Accommodations Act that would be reviewed under strict scrutiny.
Well, so what I'm getting at is right now we're looking at whether a law is generally applicable or neutral. We don't have to trigger strict scrutiny. But the Supreme Court has kind of signaled that they're interested in whether or not that generally applicable and neutral principle should exist anymore, and whether we should move to some other test, such as strict scrutiny. We don't know. That's all debate. That's all. We have no idea. So all I'm saying is that's the next.
Case is forthcoming. We know.
Yes. So when I say that's the next frontier, it's that for decades now, if there's been a law that's generally applicable and neutral, it's been allowed to incidentally burden fundamental rights. That could still be the case going forward. So there could be an argument under the Public Accommodations Act that this law is generally applicable and neutral.
483.
The Public Accommodations
Okay,
Act,
sorry.
but yes, but 483.
Right.
But it burdens my fundamental right. And I don't think Smith is good law anymore, and here's why, and here's what should happen. That could happen.
I think that some more information, or maybe a briefing about the Public Accommodations Act and whether it would incidentally burden conduct, I think would be a good conversation to have in the future.
So I would recommend certainly hearing from whoever you want to hear from. But the Human Rights Commission has jurisdiction over the Public Accommodations Act in this case. And then from my office, that would be more of an expert than me would be Damian Leonard. It would be totally appropriate for you to hear from him if you want to. But right now, the Public Accommodations Act applies if you are open to the general public, full stop. There could be an argument that that's not fair because of fundamental rights under the US Constitution, namely sincerely held religious beliefs. And right now, Smith is the law of the land. But it's possible that that's, so for example, do you want me to talk about me?
Yeah, I think it would be helpful for everybody. These things I've talked through with zillions of people, so I think it's good for everybody to sort of be on the same page.
So you all know Carson v. Macon came out of Maine. And it took years to wind its way up to the Supreme Court. And every kind of step of the way, there's a new court decision, right? There's a new legal analysis. So everyone's watching this case develop. The Maine legislature watched what was happening in each next level of litigation, anticipating the Carson decision. Amended in Maine, they have a special anti-discrimination law that's just applicable to their educational settings. They amended their law to require schools that want to receive their public tuition, take part in their public tuition program, to comply with the educational piece of their anti-discrimination laws, to make that really clear. And there was no exemption for religious schools. That law passed through Carson. Carson happened. So now in Maine, it's clear that remember in Maine, their law specifically said religious schools don't count, can't take part in the tuition program. So the Supreme Court said that's not okay. So now in order to take part in the public tuition program in Maine, Supreme Court's told them you have to allow religious schools if they're otherwise eligible to participate. But to be eligible to participate, they have to comply with the anti-discrimination law. Just last week, a religiously affiliated school sued the state of Maine, saying that's a violation of our First Amendment rights. And there was First Amendment speech, First Amendment religion, and I believe there were a couple other arguments. I have not read the whole filings yet. So there you go. So there's the argument. And so it is just a filing. It's just arguments. They asked for a preliminary injunction, which is that emergency action by the court. There's a whole analysis that has to happen if the court's going to make that or take that emergency action. But before it takes that emergency action, the state has an opportunity to respond. So there's going to be it's going to take a lot of time for there to be any precedent that is binding, if there is going to be any, to anyone, whether it's the parties, the state, or the rest of the US. But when we're talking about the next frontier, there you go.
Crazy. Very interesting.
Oh my
It's
So we're
very
not gonna
timely.
Right?
Wow.
So please continue now into the
Okay.
bill. And we're going to be a while, just so you know, you're welcome to stay. Year 3:30, we might see you.
Well, you know, a hearing a review of our file.
Yeah, exactly. So, yeah.
So I think we'll go
I will just offer that if the committee's interested in adjourning earlier, if you want to reschedule for Tuesday, that's fine too, but I'm also happy to be here.
Next one. Yeah, see at 5.
I think we can move, don't worry, I need.
Yeah, I think we
more than-
go quicker.
I think we can move through the rest of the bill faster. So okay, we're on page 8, we're in section 3 now. And for the next couple sections, what the bill does is makes kind of conforming amendments. So this is the tuition, these are the tuition statutes. So section 8, section 3 is an amendment to 821. Saying public schools, elementary, you have to maintain a public elementary school or tuition your students out. And we're making an amendment here on page 9, line 4, saying you can tuition your students to an approved independent elementary school, and we're adding eligible to receive public tuition. So you'll see in section 4, it's the same when we're talking about an approved independent high school for tuition purposes, we're just adding eligible to receive public tuition. It's the same in section 5. Again, talking about an approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition now on line 13. Section 6, same amendment to on page 11, talking just adding that eligible to receive public tuition. Same to the designation statute in section 7, modifying the approved independent school, it has to be eligible to receive public tuition. And then there's a repeal of some law on line 11, page 12, that I don't believe these school districts exist anymore after Act 46. So the law is not necessary. Section 8 is a larger amendment. So section 8 is an amendment to section 828 on page 13, lines 8 and 9. This is the statute that basically lays out every type of school that can receive, that's eligible to receive public tuition. So when we talk about recognized independent schools not being eligible to receive public tuition, where that's really coming from is they're not spelled out in this section. So we're adding a modifier there. So an approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition, I'm on line 12, located in Vermont. And current law says you can send public tuition, I'm on line 14, to an independent school in another state or country. And so H483 amends that on line 15 by striking out country and limiting public tuition to out-of-state schools that are located within 25 miles of the Vermont border.
Yes. I might be reading into it too much, but is there any possible challenge or issue with, let's say, a school that's 27 miles away from Vermont and then saying we're being discriminated against from being able to participate in Vermont's tuition program?
So I think the closest legitimate argument you could have is something under the Dormant Commerce Clause, and I am not the expert on that. I would encourage you to hear from my colleague David Hall on that.
Okay.
I believe the House Education heard testimony that, well, we're never going to tell you there's no risk in anything. But I would encourage you to hear from David on that. Okay, so big amendment here. Current law is tuition money can go anywhere in the world. This is limiting it to just this country and within 25 miles of the Vermont border. And then if you move on to page 14, these are the requirements for out-of-state approved independent schools that want to be eligible to receive public tuition. So they have on line 4, the independent school has adopted and implemented policies and procedures to comply with all anti-discrimination laws applicable to public schools in the state where the school is located, and makes reasonable efforts to enforce those policies and procedures, even if those laws by their terms do not apply to the independent school, and the school has to attest to compliance there. So that's analogous to the requirements that Vermont schools follow the Vermont anti-discrimination laws and attest to compliance. On line 10, the independent school posts and maintains on its website in a prominent place its policy to comply with all anti-discrimination laws that apply to public schools in the state where the independent school is located. Again, the Vermont independent schools are required to do that. And then line 15 is basically saying they also have to comply with everything else in subdivision 9, except for subdivision 5, which is the anti-discrimination laws. We just took care of that above that in subdivisions 1 and 2, and the attestation piece. This this subsection B in this statute has its own attestation piece wrapped in. So it's the same compliance requirements, except out-of-state schools have to follow their own anti-discrimination laws, and they have to comply to this section, or attest to this section. And so they also have to, provide an assurance, just like the in-state schools, that no public funds were used to subsidize the tuition of private payer students. So that's for out-of-state schools. There's a
question, Senator.
A note for you and the committee. I think a bookmark for later discussion is, I mean, I'm thinking about potential lawsuits with the 25-mile
Sure.
requirement. And what I'm thinking is perhaps creating a sunset where any student currently enrolled in a school outside of Vermont can finish their enrollment. But after a certain date, we cut it off completely and we don't have that 25-mile, we have nothing going outside of our state.
Right.
Something to think about.
So like your district, Northfield, Mount Hermon, those kids could finish,
Yeah,
and when they're done, then everything stays in Vermont.
yeah, I wouldn't want to take
Yeah.
a kid out of school.
Right, no, I
honestly, regardless of where they are right now.
But let those kids finish.
Let them finish. And then let's revisit the idea of not even having that 25-mile thing.
You need to just pull it back in
Required,
Vermont.
same thing, yes.
So no,
yes,
no more Massachusetts, just keep it in Vermont.
Yes.
Yeah, okay.
And we already have a test case of something that's right across the border. I mean, it seems logistically necessary to have a little bit of flexibility.
Yeah, I know, I don't
I'm sure
disagree.
there are other committees, you've got some experience that can share with us.
Yeah. And I think the Dormant Commerce Clause could also apply to that other thing. That's what I'm thinking of.
Where are you pointing?
Didn't we have a
The
cross-border?
pre-K,
Oh, right,
Yeah,
yeah.
right. I mean, that's a school.
And we'll get into this, but one of the things you'll find is we also use public schools in other states. Yeah, so if we shut them down, it could be like all the kids, I think, in not Windsor, Orange County, some of them go for the border because it's the closest high school. Rutland County, you guys have some that go over to Grant. So there are some weird things that we've got to figure out. So,
Yeah.
and then of course, the Canadian question as well. Everyone in the Northeast Kingdom wants to know if their kids can still go.
I don't think we should send
So,
it to
yes, the
Canada, but no, I do hear and agree with your point. I mean, I think that if you have a school that's 2 miles over the border, it's a pre-K place, and the other nearest school is 20 miles away, totally makes sense to send them 2 miles over. But, you know, if we have a requirement of within 5 miles, and then the private business that is 7 or 8 miles out of that perimeter says, hey, we're being discriminated against because Vermont created a law that creates this burden and we can't get involved in Vermont commerce or,
Business in New Hampshire,
yeah, business, private pre-K in New Hampshire or a private school in Massachusetts, so.
Yeah, and so David will probably be most helpful with this.
Yeah, definitely not me.
Great, Senator Stewart.
Well, I just want, just my own 2 cents of, as with everything in this building, there will always be individual cases that might benefit or suffer because of a decision that we're making. And what, in my mind, what we're trying to do here is create a system as opposed to trying to, like whack-a-mole with all of these various situations. I'm just thinking out loud.
Yeah.
It's about creating like a system that's equitable and works. Sorry, I'm looking right at Terry that whole time. Sorry, Terry.
We did something
my
somewhat
line.
similar with this, with 219. We did
Very similar.
very similar. And that's when the Dormant Commerce Clause, we may have been in violation, but we still went ahead and did it. And
I am not suggesting that this violates the Dormant Commerce
Right,
Clause.
right, no,
I
I
am
know.
suggesting you hear from my
Yeah,
colleague
yeah,
who could speak
yeah,
to that.
yeah.
And I will say that section 17 of the bill on page 22 addresses Senator Hashim's concern on a transition piece for us. Kiddos who are already in out-of-state schools. They can continue through graduation. Page 15, section 11, a very small, really on page 16, line 11. Again, conforming amendment to the dual enrollment program, making it clear that if a student is in an approved independent school that's eligible to receive public tuition, and they are actually there on public tuition, they're eligible, they meet the other requirements to participate in dual enrollment. Page 17, section 12, we're adding a definition here of therapeutic approved independent school, which means an approved independent school that limits enrollment to students who are on an IEP or a plan under section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 and who are enrolled pursuant to a written agreement between the LEA and the school. This concept has existed, it just has not been defined in Title 16, and it is defined in the 2200 series with, if not verbatim, very similar language. Section 13, we are in the special education chapter. And again, small amendment to subsection E on page 18, again, adding that modifier of an approved independent school eligible to receive public tuition. Same, section 14, section 2973, line 12. An approved independent school that is eligible to receive public tuition. Here's that Act 173 language, shall enroll any student in an individualized education program, etc. Page 19, line 17. All we're doing here is removing the definition of therapeutic school and replacing it with the term therapeutic approved independent school. Page 20, section 14A is an amendment to the Public Accommodations Act. So we're, after 14A, we get into some session law for implementing everything we just walked through, but sections 14 and up are the substance of the amendment to Title 16 and eligibility for independent schools to be able to receive public tuition. So the amendment to the Public Accommodations Act is an amendment to the definition of place of public accommodations. All it does on line 12 there is add further clarity on what the term school means, and it includes public schools, independent schools, regional career technical education centers, post-secondary career technical education centers, adult career technical education centers, comprehensive high schools, approved education programs, tutorial programs, distance learning schools, post-secondary schools, and any other type of education. Page 21, section 15 is requiring, so section 15, subsection A, is requiring AOE to create a form and determine how often that form needs to be used for some of those reporting requirements between an approved independent school and the LEA. So for attendance records and academic progress, AOE has to create the form and decide how often that form needs to be used. And they have to do that in consultation with some stakeholders on lines 9 through 11. Line 12 requires, subsection B requires AOE to create, do you want me to keep going?
Yes, please, I'm just using that.
Create the attestation form. Line 17, subsection C requires AOE to review all of the laws, rules, I'm on line 18 and 19, quality standards, reporting requirements, and required policies applicable to public schools, and make a written recommendation to the House and Senate Committees on Education regarding whether any public school requirements not already applicable should also apply to approved independent schools eligible to receive public tuition. I'm on page 22. Has to submit a written report to the General Assembly by December 1st, 2023. And in doing so, it has to consult the Vermont Independent School Association, the Vermont School Boards Association, and the Vermont NEA. Section 17 on page 22 is an out-of-state school attendance transition provision. So it allows students who are enrolled for this school year, or if they've already been accepted for next school year, in an approved independent school in another state or country that would not be eligible under 483, they can continue on public tuition until they graduate. Section 18 is a moratorium on new approved independent schools eligible to receive public tuition. It prohibits the State Board of Education from providing initial approval, so it can provide, renewals, but initial approval for an approved independent school to be eligible to receive public tuition after August 1st, 2023, and that moratorium remains in effect until the General Assembly takes further action. Section 19 requires AOE to provide information to the General Assembly by January 15th of next year on the creation of a let's see.
Student advocates.
Yeah, student advocate position. I guess yeah, it comes down there on line 15. The public
Keep
student.
track of all these reports, the dates.
Which one are we on in particular that we would want to,
The AOE, right?
Section
Yeah.
19.
okay, Agency of Education.
This is rather than, this bill does not establish a position. It asks AOE to come back with a recommendation on what a public tuition student advocate position would look like.
Okay.
Whether they could fill that internally with a role that's already there, whether they would need a new one, and what the qualifications and job description would look like for such a position. And then
How did they set some money aside for that?
No.
No, okay.
the effective date section, so there's the effective dates section themselves, a repeal of some law that we're actually amending and having take effect earlier, and the requirement that AOE create that compliance attestation form. Those all take effect on passage. There are 2 provisions that don't take effect until July 1, 2024. That's the section that has an amendment in it that's already waiting to take effect until 2024, as well as the prohibition on requiring admissions, the admissions process and the fees. Those sections don't take effect on July 1, 2024 because that process is already rolling, most likely. And then the whole rest of the bulk of the bill would take effect on July 1, 2023.
This is really comprehensive. Well, thank you very much.
Well, would you like me to?
If you're able and willing, in case any questions come up, stick around or zoom in, whatever works better for you.
Happy to stick around.
And we'll hear from Representative Thomas. I got it tight. Maybe the best way to start, if it works for you, is tell us the problem you were trying to solve. That would be great.
Sure. So we began with Peter Conlon, Chair of House Education from Cornwall. We began with a sort of getting an education on Carson v. Macon. And so that really prompted the committee to just really get a better sense of how our whole approved independent school, those who receive public dollars, how the whole system worked, what the oversight was, sort of accountability involved, and sort of as we started learning more and more and more, we sort of started developing what we call a checklist, but areas of concern that we had, and it was really an area of sort of our education system in Vermont that hasn't been looked at in a comprehensive way in quite some time by the legislature.
Act 49, right? Was the last thing.
I never know acts by or I think I remember.
Okay.
Yeah. So, and that included taking a hard look at the Rule 2200 series that the state board just worked on and is coming into play, Act 173, hearing from, half a dozen folks in the independent school world, folks in the public school world, lots of various ledge councils for various things. And so that is what really this committee bill came out of. And I guess I would, so the people have said, well, does this solve Carson v. Macon? And I'll just tell you right now, it doesn't. But it does really sort of put at the forefront Vermont's value of non-discrimination and non-bias when it comes to students who go to school, in independent school, but on public dollars. So that's sort of one of the core values that this bill seeks to address, not just discrimination, big D, legal protected classes, but also selective admissions, sort of what I would call sort of good fit bias when it comes to students on public dollars in schools that receive public dollars. It also, as we looked into it, there were some questions about, I guess I would call taxpayer accountability. We heard from a lot of superintendents of sending districts who said, once these kids leave our district, we don't really know what's going on with them. We don't even know if they've been absent for 3 days in a row, and it's our job. We have the responsibility of checking up on truancy. So we heard more and more about sort of that angle of things. You'll see part of the bill talks about coming up with reporting systems between independent schools and the LEAs or SUs that are ultimately legally responsible for these students. And then in addition to that, we, sort of learning a bit more about how the money flows, the accountability of the money, of which I would say that there's not much. If you're an approved independent school, you can charge the maximum allowable tuition or even more than that if the voters agree to it. But there's no checking up to see if maybe that school charges less to private pay students. Or, might that school be using public dollars to subsidize the tuition of private pay students? There's really no mechanism to sort of check up on that or have oversight of that. So you'll see parts of this discuss that as well. The 25-mile requirement falls into sort of a view that the town tuition program obviously started many years ago, 150 years ago or more, to provide students who live in a town that didn't operate a school to have a place to go to school. I doubt that the taxpayers, as this evolved, thought of it as turning into something where we are paying tuitions for students, at elite prep schools, way in southern New England or wherever, or throughout the country or in Europe. So that's why you see the 25-mile limit there. Again, sort of a taxpayer accountability value.
And Peter, Representative Conlon, while you're on that, because we did do something like this in 2019, did you guys have an opportunity to talk to David Hall?
So we did not.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we did not during 2019 debate.
Oh, right.
We did this time.
Okay.
And what he basically said was, he would say that education is not commerce, and therefore
Okay.
the dormant commerce clause does not apply. And he
Okay.
felt very confident. in
That's
that.
great to know. Okay, that helps us. Thank you.
And so, it also, within that sort of taxpayer, what the system is sort of turned into, or what it is continues to do, that's why you see a moratorium in there, is to sort of say, all right, this was never meant to be a growth industry. It was meant to provide an education for students whose towns didn't operate school. And I think you see that in sort of how it developed. It really began with our historic academies, from BBA and St. Johnsbury, even ones that are now public schools like the DFAs up in Fairfax and St. Albans. But that has grown into a much bigger array of independent schools, some of whom are largely accommodating students on public dollars, and some that they only have a few. And part of what sort of drove us as well was just sort of looking at websites of these schools, sort of looking to see if they were following the rules about it, testing. But then you start looking at some where they say, oh, if you're from a sending town, your tuition is the maximum allowable by law, but most private pay students pay about half that. And so we aren't saying that there's shenanigans going on, but we are saying is, we're not sure how the accounting works here, but let's at least say to them, you need to swear, attest, whatever, that you are, you don't have a different tuition, and that the financial aid that is going to the private pay students is not being subsidized by taxpayers.
So you're handling that through that attestation.
Yes.
Anything else in terms of that follow-up that you're doing? No, so it's the
The
attestation,
attestation
that's what you're
is as
saying.
far as we went. Yes.
So you saw some spots that said, all right, so you're gonna have to pay full if you're from a sending town, but it's possible that they are then offsetting the expense of a private pay.
I can't
You're thinking,
confirm that, but when I see a
No, I
website
want
where
to
it
know, I
says,
think it's a worthwhile thing to definitely look at.
I know we have, I can go to the website of one school in Chittenden County that said our tuition is $12,900,
For a
but they invoice sending towns and public dollars $16,000.
Okay, interesting, yeah, center issue.
Question about enforcement, the attestation, and during all the testimony that you heard, what did you hear about a situation in which a school says, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to, a private school, thanks, but no thanks, we're not going to attest to this, see you later. Is there, what happens in that situation?
Well, if it is a requirement to become an independent school eligible to receive public tuition, and they fail to attest, I think, and that is currently happening at the state board level right now. The state board is considering that in an incomplete application. And therefore, I mean, so what's the carrot, what's the stick here? The stick is that if you're not an approved independent school eligible to receive public dollars, you're ineligible to receive public dollars.
And so that happens yearly, right? It's the attestation.
Currently, it happens every time a school is up for approval in front of the State Board of Education, and that can be as quick as 2 years, but generally every 5 years. This would say every year.
Okay, so, all right, so they'll have to attest every year.
Yes. And
That
if
they're
and if they
in
choose not to, that puts their ability to receive public dollars in jeopardy.
Okay, thank you.
So one of the things I was thinking about, I don't know if it came up in your committee, but so if this were to go into effect, I'm thinking specifically the anti-discrimination
Mhm.
thing. I mean, we have the 2200 series also.
Yeah.
But if you were approved before the 2200 series, and now you have an approval for 5 years,
That's right.
could we, no, thank you, I mean, did you have any conversation on putting everybody up and saying, okay, new sheriff in town, everybody has to get reapproved now under the 2200 series. So you capture all of those schools and making sure none of them are discriminating.
So I would say we didn't have direct testimony to that, but we
Okay.
certainly had lots of testimony that talked about the capacity of the state board that meets monthly, has other things on its
Yeah.
to be able to do that. This solves it to a certain extent
Yeah.
by saying that the AOE now, if you don't have the attestation in place, that's a violation of statute, and that would put your eligibility in jeopardy.
Okay, so that is good. So you're saying, you used the agency of education and said, all right, you have to attest that you're not discriminating as soon as this goes into effect. And then annually, and then if you are, then you could lose. Okay. That solves it.
Yeah.
Okay. Anything else, Representative Cobb?
I think obviously Beth covered it section by section, and I just wanted to give you sort of the higher level. Yeah, I mean, the most sort of debated part of this was really the admissions portion. That this essentially does away with selective admissions based on academic history. And the other parts you saw in that little 6-7, I think 6. And the idea being that essentially a student who is taxpayer funded, is a public school student or publicly funded student, that no publicly funded student should be told you're not the right fit for our school or you don't fit our culture. So let me sort of think of it as removing selected admissions for publicly funded students. And I know that there were questions before about, well, what's the counterbalance to public schools? So I would just say, number one, public schools admit everybody in your district, first of all, with no questions asked. Obviously, you just are enrolled. And I'd say statute is vague on non-resident tuition paying students. I've actually asked Ledge Council to come up with some language, which I would give her full permission to share with all of you. That basically says you also will enroll, not through the process, a non-resident tuition student, because that's actually what happens in practice anyway. We had a superintendent testify that said, this question came up, we do get some tuitioning students from sending towns. We talked to our lawyer about, can we be selective? And he said, no, you will be sued. So in practice, it doesn't really happen, but to sort of punch that up in statute, I don't think anybody would object to.
Right. And Representative, can you give us an example of, so a public kid who's not in the district goes to another school, that would just be a circumstance where the family might say they're appealing to the local school board and say, hey, the school just.
Oh no, it's more, I was really referring to non-operating districts.
Oh, that go to the public. Okay, got it.
So for
Got
example,
it.
in my
Yeah,
district,
yeah,
kids from Hancock and Granville have no school.
yeah,
They go to all sorts of different public schools.
got it. Thank you. Senator Hewitt.
Thank you. Thank you very much for this presentation. I appreciate that you all look closely at discrimination. Thank you for that. I'm wondering how much emphasis or how much you looked at equity. And I'm bringing up the word equity because I'm thinking of, for example, one of the factors I think that makes a school or a school district run smoothly and be ultimately successful is like retaining folks in positions, so job retention. An independent school, because it's not beholden to a school board, might be able to pay its principal or I'm not sure, dean of students or whatever you want to call it, $350,000 a year. Of course, that person's probably going to stay there for 25 years. Wow, what a level of continuity that they will get to benefit from. Whereas a school district that's beholden to the school board is probably under much more tight scrutiny financially. That's just one example that came to my mind. Yesterday, I learned that independent schools don't have to provide a food program, for example. And that to me is also an inequity and potentially even discriminatory. Are those things that you all looked at all?
So we did not get into how an independent school chooses to operate. This was really about the admission of publicly funded students.
One of the things you mentioned, the report back on attendance, and you said, hey, superintendent might not know, even in a sending community, whether or not kids are showing up to their, even an independent school. Are there any sending districts that have no school, like pre-K through 12, no school at all, and it's just an LEA? So would that report just go to the LEA? Okay.
So Kingdom Choice, for example,
Okay.
is a district that has no schools.
Okay,
Yeah.
nothing.
Nothing.
All those kids have to go somewhere else.
Yeah.
Okay, that's helpful. Yeah, Senator Weeks.
In your research, did you find any schools that had limited seats that were available to the tuition students?
Oh, you mean, did they have?
Like there were more students that needed to be placed in those seats in the school to fit them?
Well, I guess, I don't know if we have a specific answer to that, except to say that what we did find is that even in areas like the Northeast Kingdom, where a lot of students have choice, every public school has capacity that is currently unfilled. So like Linden Elementary School could handle another 100 kids. So in the public school world, there's capacity. In the independent school world, there may be lottery. And I think that we did hear from an independent school in Linden. I think where they said, yeah, we were oversubscribed.
So it's your committee's preference that the lottery take precedent over the independent school being able to evaluate the fit of the student by academic records or whatever?
Yes, that admission should be non-discriminatory.
The only question about the admissions thing is, are there any special education schools where you really need, it's Greenwood School, I'm thinking, I always thought it was
So
like
none of
specific for,
483 applies to therapeutic schools.
so you're putting therapeutic schools in with special education schools?
I guess I think that's the definition.
Oh, I didn't know, okay.
I mean, a therapeutic school within
I'm
this.
sorry, I always thought it was, you could have a dyslexia, but I never considered that to be a therapeutic school.
I think, well, a therapeutic school is defined in here
As,
as
okay.
accommodating only students on an IEP.
And those students can still go through this kind of admission process to make sure that.
Yeah. I mean,
Yeah,
because
sometimes.
therapeutic schools offer different services.
Got it. That's helpful. Thank you. Yeah.
Just curious, again, in your research, did you know, it's common for a university, at a university level or college level to have fees and tuition. In your research, did you find any of the independent schools also had broken apart their tuition from their fees?
Oh, absolutely.
And why wouldn't the fees be, given our understanding of fees as, it's a bit of a game, but it's, it does account for the full cost of the education. How come fees are specifically declined or rejected?
That is to say that a public school, a publicly funded student, we tried to make it as sort of parallel to the public school situation, and we don't charge a public school student academic fees. So it doesn't talk about other fees, it talks about academic fees. That a school wanting to accept publicly funded students, i.e. taxpayer dollars, cannot charge that student extra academic fees.
So both public and independent can charge for a lacrosse stick,
Yeah, this talks about
like just academic. You can't say you gotta own your own copy of Moby Dick.
We don't talk about uniforms,
Yeah.
we don't talk about sports.
But a independent school could charge its paying students for a fee, an academic fee. That couldn't in this bill charge for a tuition student.
Right. Correct, yeah, there's nothing here that regulates how they deal with private students.
Just another question, just to kind of get up to speed on the bill. So you're talking about not subsidizing tuition for private payer students, which I get, but do the tuition students pay full tuition? If, for example, hypothetically, and I don't know the cost of the independent school, but say it's $3,000 higher than the district cost, per student cost. Do we pay that extra $3,000?
So the state statute, and certainly you should talk with Ledge Council more about this, state statute is set that a district cannot be charged more than the average announced tuition. Now, there are some exceptions to that, unless the voters of that district okay it. So there are real examples of this. Byrne Academy, for example, their tuition is higher than the average announced tuition. The communities that send to Byrne have to have a vote that says we will pay the extra. But that's not required. And then there are exceptions such as Sharon Academy and Thedford Academy that meet Vermont education quality standards. And if they do that, they have the right to basically charge what they feel is appropriate.
Okay, so question goes to now, are there independent schools which charge more for their paying students, but in fact, the tuition students go in at a lower fee?
Not without the parents having to pay the extra. So for example, Vermont Academy, that's a private elite boarding school. And so in this case, it really operates more as a voucher. And so you get the voucher and then you have to pay the extra.
So Vermont Academy and the Putney School, I think, are our two sort of maybe purely independent schools. Even under this, if you want to go to Putney or Vermont Academy with public funds, still no interview, you have to take the student.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah, and it allows them to sort of say, we've got 15 slots
Okay.
for public pay students.
Okay.
Can we just take 2 seconds to discriminate between private and independent? Because when you talk about Vermont Academy and Putney, those are private schools, right?
What's the statute? What do we use in statute?
That's St. James Office
Yeah.
of Legislative Counsel. So in the state of Vermont, the term independent school
Yeah.
captures private schools.
Okay.
And then those independent schools are broken into 2 general categories. There's approved independent schools, which are eligible to receive public tuition now.
Yeah.
And they have a whole host of hoops they have to jump through for regulatory purposes. Then there are recognized independent schools that are not eligible to receive public tuition. And that is like a registry. They have to
And
essentially.
I don't want to go down a rabbit hole, but why do we not use the word private?
I don't know the answer.
Okay.
I'm sure that is a policy decision.
Okay.
Many.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just curious.
Senator Weeks.
I'm just curious, getting your research, because I know you guys have done months of work on this. Was there a list created of the schools that this would affect with independent schools or with tuition students?
I think that the AOE already maintains a listing of approved independent schools eligible to receive public tuition.
It's on their website.
So, yeah.
Right, but the next question is if the number of students, just kind of get a sense of scale. I mean,
Sure.
Right now, it's a theoretical problem, but it's
4,000
real.
is the number that's thrown around.
I was gonna say
4,000
3,800, yeah.
Students.
Students attend approved independent schools eligible to receive public tuition. And so I have a statewide number of 84,000.
The 25-mile rule, again, in your research, did you determine if there are actually any, are we accounting for all like current usage of out-of-state schools that are?
Yeah, I mean, whatever number we picked was going to be arbitrary, was by definition. So we went 25 to see what public reaction would be, and it was in the committee bill really early on. And we didn't get any real pushback from it.
Even if we had that list of 4,000 students, we knew what.
You would find a very small number attend a school farther than 25 miles from the border.
That's a real mix of public and independence, I think.
Well, I'd say if you go beyond 25, you're
Then
talking
you're getting
about.
independence. Yeah, Senator Sheen.
Just out of curiosity, did you hear about any numbers of students who are going to the Netherlands, Japan, France,
Yes.
Canada? How many students are going overseas?
We're talking
9.
between, well, I'd say, yeah, between 2 and 9.
And S 219, which we passed last year, also said we're gonna end that. But we also gave them time to close their experience out.
Yeah, and the border issue is important, we, on the, in Wyndham County, we've got, I think it's Wyndham County, don't know my southern counties all that well, but we've got like Stamford, Vermont, and everybody there goes to high school in Massachusetts. Up in Northeast Kingdom, you got like Guildhall and some of those other ones, and they're going to Lancaster, New Hampshire's high school, White Mountain High School, a lot of them. So the crossing the border part, at least you're going to a public school, is very important.
So there's your 0 mile rule. Okay. If they're doing it now, I don't think we want to wound them. If it's a relationship that exists, it's working well, why would you want to just create,
Not let
Well,
anybody.
just to be clear, I didn't say that I necessarily want to. My concern was us getting sued for violating the Dormant Commerce Clause. So, but I hear your point.
sort of
Please,
based on your research, so I know that in the bill, you don't want an independent school to be charging more than their actual, what they charge their paying students. At the same time, did you find that there were any schools which had an endowment where the student was benefiting from the school's overall financial picture, including its endowments?
So I guess we did not get into that. And I think that, you would find that there are schools with endowments and sort of what that relationship is to what they charge their students. We require them to open their books. They're very resistant to do that. But those tend to exist at the schools where their tuition is pretty much right out there. The tuition is the tuition, whether you are private pay or public dollars.
Senator Williams.
Just a converse to that, I spoke to a district business manager.
Yeah.
That one of the town schools, one of the high schools, tuitions students to a religious school. Their cost per student, according to him, was $7,000. He was upset, and the people in this town that he was from paying $19,000 per student. And he was upset because the religious schools was charging $14,000
Okay.
to take our students.
Oh,
Yep.
that's interesting.
Yep.
You could spend a lot of time
Yes.
cruising around websites.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Seeing
That's
what is
interesting.
charged. And so, like I said, there was one in Chittenden County, they're right on their website,
Yeah.
12.9 is the
Yeah.
tuition. They're invoicing public paying 7 districts, 16,000.
Wow. Anything else for representation? Yeah, no,
Last
this is
one,
helpful.
last one.
This is good.
So-
Gives us an idea.
So due to districts that don't have their own schools, the state of Vermont is benefiting from tuitioning students into this kind of high school, elementary school desert. We're benefiting from it, but we seem to be pushing these guys really hard Just wondering if in the development of the bill, we're looking to find compromise, recognizing the fact that if they say no, what happens to those students?
Sure. And I'd say, you know, I'm not sure benefiting is the word I would use. I'm not sure that benefiting, that we would be benefiting from having public schools available. But in those areas where there are school deserts, and I think we can talk about the Kingdom Choice District where there's literally no school available. These days, there are public schools the same distance as many of the independent schools that have capacity for all of the students.
So is that kind of the second order effect, is we're trying to push them in that direction?
No, you know, we really aren't trying to do anything here other than to say that if you want to take public dollars, you know, you need to have some safeguards about how the money is being used, and that the students who go there on public dollars should face similar lack of obstacles as if they were enrolling in public school. Right. Because that's how these independent schools are supposed to be operating to, if their mission is to replace the non-existent public school.
I'll pass it. Okay. Did you hear from, just out of curiosity, any complaints from parents around their kids not getting into any schools, anything like that?
Well, we didn't have it,
you know,
so
that
I would
sort
say
of
we
thing.
did not have direct testimony.
Okay.
We received letters.
You did receive some, okay,
Yeah.
yeah.
And some stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
And I understand where somebody might not want to come in.
Right.
I completely respect that. Yeah. Okay. Oh, my question, Senators Kitchell and Starr live up north. Why no Canada?
So it's an interesting discussion
Yeah.
because everybody had their own reason,
Yeah,
and it became sort of a cumulative reason.
okay,
So there were those who basically said, "Oh, why are we sending tax dollars out of our country?"
Yeah.
There were those who said, "Why are we sending tax dollars out of our country for students who are literally driving by public schools with space?"
okay.
In
So
order
there
to-
are schools, so it's not like a New Hampshire situation, and I don't know that area as well.
Right. We're
it's just over the
It's
border.
really just Stansted University.
Okay,
And what we heard was that it is faster, perhaps closer, to go to a public school, and there's plenty of for the 2 students attending Stansted.
thank you.
Correct.
Okay,
And then the third reason, it's a little more complex,
okay,
but under Act 173, if the LEA or the IEP team says this is the best place to place this student, but then needs to also provide services within that independent school, how do you do that over an international border?
interesting, right.
For complicated.
Act 173, which goes into effect in July, and the 2200 series is already in effect.
So some of the 2200 also kicks in July 1st as well.
Also, July 1st, okay, thank you. So how was it then that the state board was able to say, oh, no, to those recent attempted approvals? I thought they were referring to 2200 series.
Well, so that part must have kicked in May 1st.
Okay, so the anti-discrimination stuff is
Kicked in.
already happening as well, and Act 173 begins in July. Okay. We're gonna go back and look at Act 49. Did you look at Act 49 at all?
Did we look at Act 49 at all? I don't think so.
Senator Ruth sat in the seat for Act 49, and he said, go back and take a look. That was all the independent school early discussions. What?
So
I'll just give you an early preview.
Please.
It's Beth St. James
Yeah.
Legislative Council. So Act 49 required an approved independent school working group
Yeah,
in
That's what it said.
response to the 2200 series rulemaking. that
Okay.
had begun and then was paused
yeah,
by Act 49.
okay,
The working group, I believe, began the discussion of what led to Act 173, which came out in 2018.
okay,
The working group itself did not have much consensus.
okay.
And in fact, the report basically starts by saying,
We don't
we
agree.
don't have a lot of consensus. So
That's good to know.
We'll
Okay,
preview
that's
what
good to
we'll
know.
see
Yeah,
next week.
that's really good to know. Yes, Senator do it.
These are my personal closing remarks for the day. I just want you all to know that. But I just want to say, I think it's a great bill and I really appreciate your work. And I especially appreciate that you're turning off the spigot on new schools. I think that's great. That's just.
Where did that idea come from?
Yeah.
Well,
We are
no,
not,
actually-
we are not afraid to borrow good ideas. when we see them.
Absolutely.
Including 219, which was frankly,
Thank
a
you
basis
for
for a
that.
lot
Thank
of
you.
this.
Appreciate that. Yeah, we
Yeah.
did do.
No,
Let's
you're
do
not
it. Yeah, exactly.
and you know,
Turning off the spigot for new schools.
Yeah, we'll dig it out later.
Yeah.
Turning that spigot off, just turning it off.
you know,
I know you
if
guys
anybody
have
has
this for a
questions,
while.
grab me anytime. I'm always happy to talk about this.
Great.
This is good. Thanks.
Not newly constructed public schools. No, that's not.
Yeah,
no,
no,
we
she's
want
not
more
looking to-
additional. Yeah, we want
Yeah,
more.
yeah, she's not looking to stop school construction.
For the record, that is not. what
We
it
will
meant.
not ask you anything about PCBs. Is that, all right?
Yeah, no, I'm in no hurry.
No.
Thank you,
No.
Representative Conlon.
Appreciate your time as well.
Yeah,
with this.
thank
you.
Appreciate you sticking
Excellent
around.
questions.
Yeah, thanks a
Can
million.
we get him on the Senate board?
What's that?
Can we get him on the Senate board?
Thank you.
Happy to visit anytime.
Yeah, thanks. Committee, anything else for today? Your end that you need to cover, or should we? I'm looking for an emotion. Yes.
Question.
Okay, yeah.
S66.
Yeah.
That's kind of, this really is a lot more detailed.
I've been
Oh,
keeping this. Okay, sorry.
right.
No, go ahead.
This is a lot more detailed than 66.
I think it's different in some ways. I don't know if it's more or less detailed. The walk through 66 was a while ago. It's doing, yeah,
There's an overlap.
there's some overlap.
All right.
So if this passes.
Yeah.
What happens to that?
Well, nothing, so just so you know, going forward, all of these things still are in play until we are out of session. I mean,
Right.
nothing, unless, if you want, if it helps you, we can make a motion to order something to lie right now, technically. We have the same rules as before. So anything could happen in this committee that technically happens on the floor. But, so everything is still in play unless we were to do something like that. Before you get on the road with those sunglasses, Mr. Tinney is here
Okay,
for a
okay.
moment. And Mr. Tinney, as you can tell, it's, well, let's just say, we are looking for, you don't even need to read this, we have it in front of us. But we would like to know whether or not you support universal school meals. And if you don't, let us know that. And if you do, let us know that. But you needn't read this word for word. We have it. So just if you could give us an overview of your position.
Sure. I got that hint with a pair of sunglasses. Senator.
Sorry.
Right.
So yes, we wholeheartedly support universal school meals. I believe our membership, it's fair to say, feel more strongly about it now than they did before, because they see how important it has been since it's been in place. And as I put in my testimony, the written testimony, that it would be really close to catastrophic if we were to withdraw the program now. It has become very valuable. And
There are weeks.
Thanks, sir. Just a curiosity question, being that you represent a constituent body, is there any kind of, can you throw a number at us, like it's 100%, your constituent 100% supportive, or?
well, I haven't, the only thing I can say is that, I have not heard a single educator say that they have not appreciated this universal school meals. So we've had meetings across the state in our, we call them fall area meetings, and we had our all membership meeting, representative assembly a couple of weeks ago in Stowe, and across the board, people have spoken very highly of universal school meals. If there, certainly there may be someone out there who doesn't necessarily appreciate it, but I have not heard of anybody that has.
I guess I was just curious if there was, I don't know, if a referendum or what have you in your line of work is common, or if that's how you develop policy. I'm just not sure how that works. So I was just curious.
No, we have a series of regional meetings, and then all our resolutions and new business items are established at a representative assembly in March. And so far, it's been nothing but supportive of school meals. And if usually, and I can assure you, if educators are unhappy with a program, it usually makes it to my office.
Okay. Any other questions for Mr. Kinney at this point? Thank you very much. We're going to continue to take some testimony next week. We have a fiscal note in our file, in our folder as well. And we'll leave it there. Hope you have a lovely weekend, Don.
Okay, you too. Thank you.
Thanks.